She sat in row 9 by the window seat, her gray hoodie pulled over her pale face, her hands folded around a small cloth bag resting in her lap, and the hum of the engines filled the air with a low trembling sound as the cabin lights flickered in. The storm outside the plane shook gently, and the flight attendant smiled, nervously trying to calm the passengers, but tension still spread like smoke through the rows. Everyone assumed she was just another nervous traveler, someone who wanted to hide from the world behind her hood, her downward gaze and her silence. But there was something about her stillness, something that felt different, like a shadow that carried weight. Though nobody noticed at first, the intercom suddenly crackled with static, and a voice asked in a strained tone if there were any trained pilots on board. The words struck the cabin like thunder. People gasped, some laughed nervously, others pulled out their phones to record the moment. The idea of needing a pilot from the passenger seats seemed like a strange movie scene, yet the fear in the voice was real. Evelyn, the quiet woman in row 9, moved her thumb slowly to the small call button above her head and pressed at the flight attendant, who rushed over. Was a woman named Karen, her uniform perfect, her smile sharp but thin. She leaned close and whispered with sugar-coated words, "Ma'am, please stay seated. Do not panic, we have it under control." But her voice betrayed a thin crack of doubt. Evelyn did not answer. She only looked at Karen with pale blue eyes that seemed calm and heavy, like she carried storms of her own. Karen stepped back, uncomfortable, but before she could say more, a businessman in row 5 leaned out into the aisle. His expensive watch catching the light as he smirked and said loud enough for all to hear, "What is this, some kind of show? She looks like she missed her bus to the shelter." His words drew laughter from a few others, the sound cruel and sharp like broken glass. The plane rattled again, the overhead bins shaking, cups clattering in the galley. A baby began to cry, and the laughter died down into whispers. Evelyn's fingers moved against the cloth of her bag, feeling the frayed edges, the sturdy old fabric that looked like it had traveled more miles than anyone on board. She slipped her sneakers off, leaving them under the seat, and placed her bare feet on the carpet of the cabin floor. Her steps, when she rose, were quiet but steady, like each movement was guided by memory. Passengers stared as she began to walk toward the front. Some sneered, some whispered, some simply watched, frozen in their seats. The drunk man in a wrinkled polo shirt stood in the aisle, swaying and pointing at her, shouting, "Hey lady, sit back down. You think you are some hotshot pilot. Go back to your seat and let the crew handle this." His finger shook, his words heavy with alcohol, yet when her eyes met his, he faltered for a breath. Her gaze calm, piercing, and unshaken, she stepped to the side and past him without speaking. The cabin felt colder as she moved forward, every sound echoing louder, the clicks of heels from Karen, who followed nervously, the rustle of jackets, the low mutter of passengers who did not understand what they were seeing. A teenage boy in row 8 pulled out his phone, whispering, "Yo, this is wild." His sister, chewing gum, leaned closer, her eyes wide, the whole scene now becoming something everyone would remember. Halfway down the aisle, a woman with fire red nails and a silk blouse hissed to her friend, "Probably thinks she is in a Tom Hanks movie." Her laughter cutting through the tension, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Evelyn did not slow down. Her bag hung at her shoulder, and in her right hand she held a dull black piece of metal, no bigger than a card, its edges worn smooth. It looked ordinary, but the way she carried it, steady, as if it was part of her own body, made people stare in silence. The turbulence grew stronger, the plane tilted sharply, and a tray of cups crashed to the floor. A baby wailed louder. Rosa, an old woman in row 11, clutched her rosary beads and shook her head at the mockery of the younger passengers, her murmured prayers filling the space like a shield. While Karen tried again, her voice louder, "Now ma'am, please, this area is for trained personnel, only we cannot allow this." But her voice trembled, betraying fear. Evelyn walked on each step, silent, her bare feet gripping the carpet, her shoulders straight, her gaze locked on the front, as if she was walking through memories, not just a cabin aisle. The passengers' whispers grew like a storm around her, some angry, some afraid, some curious, but none of it slowed her down. At last she reached the cockpit door. It was half open, and the captain stood there, his hair gray, his hands trembling from long hours of strain. His eyes lifted when he saw her, and in that instant his posture changed. He straightened fully and gave a sharp salute, a salute so deliberate that the entire cabin behind her went still. The smirks faded, the laughter died, and even the drunk man sat down quietly. Only sound was the crying baby and the heavy breathing of passengers too shocked to speak. Evelyn did not turn back. She stepped into the cockpit, and the door shut softly behind her, leaving the cabin buzzing with whispers, questions, and fear. The cabin was buzzing like a hive after the door closed behind her. Passengers whispering nervously, some trying to joke, others clutching their seats tighter. And in the middle of that storm of voices, a teenage boy whispered to his sister, "I think she is serious," while his phone kept recording every step she had taken inside the cockpit. The air felt heavier than the cabin. The captain, a man with gray hair, deep lines around his eyes, and tired hands, turned to face her, his voice low but steady, as he said, "I never thought I would see you again." Ghost Hawk, and those two words carried weight that the co-pilot Derek did not understand. Derek, a younger man with a buzz cut and sharp jaw, laughed harshly, shaking his head. He said, "Captain, this is not a fighter jet. This is a Boeing Dreamliner, and we cannot let some stranger touch the controls. She looks like she just came from the street." His voice dripped with sarcasm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty as the storm outside howled louder. Evelyn did not answer. She set her bag down carefully on the floor and pulled back her hoodie, revealing her pale face more clearly, and on her wrist a faded tattoo stretched across her skin. Op Echo G12. The ink blurred with age but still strong, enough to make the captain's eyes widen and Derek's laughter falter, though he tried to cover it with another smirk. The panels flickered, red warning lights glowing as turbulence shook the cockpit harder. The captain steadied himself, gripping the console, his voice lower now. "Ghost Hawk, the system is failing and ground control says diagnostics are delayed. We may lose the right engine." She nodded, once calm like she had been here before, her hand brushing against the edge of the auxiliary controls. In the cabin outside, panic spread wider. Passengers argued louder. The businessman Greg from row 5 stood up again, shouting about safety and demanding answers. His tie loose, his face flushed with anger, he pointed at the cockpit door and yelled, "Why is some nobody allowed in there? This is madness. I paid for first class, not a circus." The words sent ripples through the rows, some agreeing, some frowning, and others too scared to speak. The young flight attendant, Leia, stood frozen near the galley, clutching napkins that trembled in her hands. Marissa, the influencer with fire-red nails, tapped on her phone, her voice sharp as she announced to her friend, "I am tweeting this right now. Random woman takes over cockpit. Disaster in the making." But her smug tone failed to cover the shaking in her hands. Rosa in row 11 kept praying, her rosary beads clicking gently, and the sound seemed to calm the woman with the toddler next to her, the child crying softer as the mother whispered, "She is not a nobody. She's doing something no one else can." The words spread quietly to Leia, who nodded slowly, her hands steadier now as she bent down to pick up the dropped napkins. Back in the cockpit, Derek leaned forward, scoffing again. He said, "Captain, listen to me. This woman cannot fly a Dreamliner. Maybe she played soldier once, but this is different." His voice was sharp but shaky. Evelyn, still silent, opened a small leather notebook from her bag. Its cover, worn, its edges frayed. Her fingers brushed across the initials, JM, carved faintly into the surface. She did not speak at first, just held the notebook close, then set it gently beside the controls. Derek mocked her, saying, "What is that, your diary?" But his words died when she finally spoke, her voice calm and quiet. "It is my son's." The cabin seemed to breathe with her words, though most could not hear them. The captain, Harrington, looked at her tattoo again, then at the notebook, and said softly, "You have flown this bird before, haven't you?" Evelyn nodded. Just once, her eyes scanning the radar and the blinking lights. She whispered, "Dreamliner 1 engine failing, 50-meter visibility, crosswinds at 90. Her voice clipped like reciting from memory while her fingers moved across the switches, steady and exact. Derek's smirk weakened, his arms crossing tighter, as though he wanted to argue, but something inside Him faltered outside. The storm grew wilder. Lightning flashed against the windows. The plane tilted, and passengers screamed. Cups fell. Trays clattered. A man dropped his laptop and shouted, "We are going to crash!" The panic rising in waves while Greg's voice boomed again, demanding the crew remove the woman from the cockpit, but his words were drowned out by the shaking of the cabin. Meanwhile, Evelyn's calm presence spread through the cockpit. Harrington watching her with something like respect. Derek watching with disbelief. The radio crackled. Ground control, shouting not to allow unauthorized personnel at the controls, but Evelyn did not look up, her hands moving to an old switch hidden below the modern panel. The hum of the engine shifted slightly, and the plane steadied just enough to feel it. The captain whispered, almost in awe, "That is the old military override. They removed it years ago, but she knows it. She still remembers." Evelyn kept her focus, her bare feet planted firmly, her face calm, her eyes fixed on the instruments like she was reading a story written only for her in the cabin. Silence slowly returned as people felt the sudden change, the shaking, softer the tilt easing. Passengers looked around, confused, their fear pausing. Rosa's prayer slowing, her beads still in her hand. Children looking up from tears, their voices quieter. Even Marissa lowered her phone, her fingers frozen above the screen. Greg still muttered angrily, but the old worker with calloused hands stood in row 14 and said loud enough for others to hear, "You don't know her, but I knew someone like her once, and you better let her work." His rough voice carried more weight than Greg's angry shouts. The cabin grew quieter again, people unsure but listening back in the cockpit. Derek stared at the radar, then at the override panel, his disbelief slowly crumbling as Harrington nodded firmly, his voice stronger now. "Ghost Hawk, take it from here." And Evelyn's hands moved again, calm, steady, and unshaken as the storm outside roared on. The storm outside slammed against the plane, harder than before, lightning streaking across the dark sky and thunder rolling through the clouds as passengers clutched their seats. The cabin lights flickered and fear grew louder, but behind the cockpit door Evelyn stood calm, her hands steady on the auxiliary panel, her bare feet pressing against the floor, like she belonged there more than anyone else. Co-pilot Derek leaned forward, his jaw tight, his voice sharp as he said, "Captain, we cannot let her continue. This is against protocol." But the captain, Harrington, did not look away from Evelyn, his eyes fixed on the tattoo on her wrist and the way her fingers moved with memory. "Not guesswork," he said quietly. "Ghost Hawk," and the name slipped out like a secret carried on the wind. Derek froze, his sarcasm fading, replaced by disbelief. "Ghost Hawk," he repeated, and the word carried weight. Even though he did not understand it, outside in the cabin, whispers rose as the flight attendants tried to calm the passengers, but someone near the cockpit had heard the name and repeated it, and soon it traveled through the rows like fire. "Ghost Hawk, Ghost Hawk." Some passengers muttered the name like a question, others like a legend. Greg, the businessman, still angry, shouted from his seat, "What kind of nonsense is this? Who even is she?" But his words sounded smaller now against the growing silence. Marissa kept typing on her phone, her smug expression thin, as her fingers hesitated while she wrote the words. "Strange woman called Ghost Hawk takes over flight." Inside the cockpit, Evelyn took a slow breath and whispered, "Sensor drift 6 degrees. Already." Her voice calm, clipped, like she was reciting from a manual. Derek scoffed and said, "Sure, and I am the president." But his words were weak, his eyes still locked on her hands as they brushed across the switches with certainty. She opened her old leather notebook, setting it on the panel, her thumb brushing over the carved initials, J.M. Derek rolled his eyes and said, "Is that your diary again?" Trying to laugh, but Evelyn turned her pale gaze toward him and said softly, "It is my son's," and her words cut the air, sharp and final. Derek's mouth closed, and he looked away, his smirk gone. Harrington studied her with quiet respect, his voice lower. "Now you have flown this bird before, haven't you?" Evelyn nodded, once her eyes on the blinking lights. "Dreamliner 1, engine down, crosswinds 90, visibility 50 meters, she spoke with precision. And Harrington's shoulders eased for a moment. Like a man who finally saw hope in the storm. Back in the cabin, fear turned into confusion. Some passengers prayed louder, Rosa's voice steady with her beads clicking softly. Others argued, Greg waving his arms shouting this is madness, while the quiet worker from row 14 lifted his photo of a soldier and said firmly, let her do this, you don't know what she carries. The weight of his voice silenced a few. Around him, the teenage boy in row 8 filmed everything, his camera focused on Greg's red face, his sister chewing gum, whispering, this is going viral already. Mia, the girl in row 14, glanced toward the cockpit door, her hands shaking, but her voice clear as she said softly, she is trying to save us, though her words were drowned by Marissa's loud laugh as she bragged to her friend about live tweeting a disaster. Karen, the senior flight attendant, tried to keep order, her voice trembling as she begged everyone to sit down, but her authority cracked with each shake of the plane until finally the younger attendant, Leia, whispered not to herself but loud enough for others to hear, she is not a nobody, and those words, small but strong, spread like a ripple, turning heads and softening voices inside the cockpit. Evelyn ignored the chaos, her eyes locked on the instruments, the storm flashing through the windshield. She reached for a hidden switch, pulling it down, and the panel hummed with a deep sound. Harrington gasped, his voice almost reverent. That is the old military override, they phased it out years ago, but she knows it, she remembers it. Derek leaned closer, his disbelief shaking into curiosity. The plane steadied for a breath, just a small shift, but enough for everyone to feel it. The screaming baby quieted, the mother holding him tighter. Passengers looked around, uncertain. Marissa's fingers froze above her phone. Greg's shouting lost power as people began to realize something was changing. Evelyn's voice cut through the cockpit like a blade. Give me 30 seconds of silence. Harrington nodded at once, and even Derek stayed quiet. The storm still roared, but inside the cockpit time slowed. Her fingers moved across the controls, her eyes scanning the flickering radar like she was seeing a language no one else could read. The radio crackled, ground control demanding no unauthorized personnel at the controls. But Harrington ignored them, his trust placed fully in Evelyn, her hands steady, her shoulders straight, the faint scar beneath her ear catching the glow of the lights for just a second before fading back into shadow. Cabin waited, the silence heavier than before. Rosa prayed under her breath, the young woman in row 9 across from Evelyn's empty seat whispered, come on, whoever you are, you can do this, and her words, though soft, carried hope that others felt around her. Then the plane lurched again, but steadied quickly this time, and the hum of the override system grew stronger. Derek finally leaning back in his seat, his arms uncrossed, his eyes watching her with something close to respect. The passengers sensed it, too, their fear shifting into awe, though they still did not understand who Evelyn really was. She pressed one last switch and whispered, override mode, echo 0, her voice low but certain, and the lights across the panel shifted from red to green. Harrington let out a breath he had been holding for hours, his voice steady, now Ghost Hawk, you've got it. And Evelyn's pale eyes reflected the screen's calm, unshaken, while the storm raged on outside. The cabin trembled with every gust of wind, the storm outside hammering the wings with relentless force, yet inside the whispers were louder than the thunder. Passengers leaning close to each other, phones glowing in shaky hands, and the word ghost hawk moving down the rows like a current. Nobody sure what it meant, but everyone sensing it carried power. Greg, the businessman, stood again, his tie hanging loose, his face red with anger. He shouted toward the cockpit, this is outrageous. That woman is no one, she does not belong there. And his voice shook, not just with fear but with pride cracking under pressure. Marissa lifted her phone higher, announcing to anyone listening, I am live streaming this right now. The world will know how unsafe this is. Her painted nails tapping the screen with practiced ease, but her hands trembled slightly, betraying her. Near the galley, the young flight attendant, Leia, dropped another stack of napkins, her cheeks burning as passengers glared. But the woman with the toddler touched her arm gently, whispering, she is not a nobody, she is doing what none of them can do. Leia swallowed hard, her eyes wet, and nodded slowly, courage flickering like a spark inside her as she bent to pick up the napkin steadier This time Rosa in row 11 kept her prayers steady, her voice low but firm, her beads clicking in rhythm. Each sound calming those who sat near her, while the man in the faded denim jacket from row 14 lifted his photo again, the edges worn. The face of a soldier faint but clear. He said louder this time, "Trust her for once in your lives. Trust someone. Who knows what they are doing?" His voice gravelly strong enough to make Greg hesitate, though his mouth still twisted with anger. In row 9, where Evelyn had been sitting earlier, a young woman now sat clutching her cardigan tighter, her knuckles white against the armrest. But when she overheard Marissa mocking Evelyn again, her fear shifted into fire. She stood trembling but clear. "Stop it," she said, pointing at Marissa. "You do not know what she is doing up there. She is trying to save us." Her voice cracked, but her eyes stayed firm, the words making Rosa glance up from her beads with approval. The cabin grew uneasy, torn between doubt and hope as phones kept filming and whispers carried to every corner. Mia, the teenage girl with anime patches on her hoodie, whispered to her brother, "This is going to be everywhere online." Her brother shook his head, saying softly, "Some things are bigger than views." Inside the cockpit, Evelyn leaned closer to the radar, her fingers brushing the old override switches. The storm still battering the plane, but her movements calm, precise. She muttered, jamming, her eyes narrowing. Harrington frowned, asking, "Jamming in this storm?" Evelyn did not answer, her focus unbroken, her hands moving to a hidden switch, and with one pull the screens shifted, revealing a green grid coded and unfamiliar to commercial eyes. Derek leaned in disbelief, his voice soft. "Override mode, Echo 0. I thought that was only rumor." The radio crackled again, ground control's voice urgent. "Captain, keep unauthorized personnel away." But Harrington did not respond, his eyes on Evelyn, while Derek sat back, his arms no longer crossed, his jaw tight but silent respect creeping into his face. Evelyn's scar caught the dim light again, her pale eyes locked on the shifting radar. The cabin felt the change, the turbulence easing, just enough for breaths to steady the baby. In row 12 stopped crying. The boy in row 7 lifted his head from his mother's chest, whispering, "Mom, it feels better." His mother and nurse nodded, tears on her cheeks, but her grip loosening. Marissa typed slower, deleting one line of her post, starting another, less confident this time. Greg still muttered, pacing the aisle, shouting about first-class rights. But fewer heads nodded now, some passengers glaring at him, others whispering enough. An older man in a pilot jacket finally stood, walking toward the galley, his voice low but steady. "I knew a ghost hawk once saved my squad in 14. If that is her, you all owe her your lives." And silence rippled across the rows. Marissa lowered her phone. Greg faltered, though he tried to laugh it off. Leia heard those words, her breath catching, her courage rising. She whispered louder this time to the passengers around her, "She is not a stranger. She has a name, she has a past. She knows this plane." And the quiet power of her words spread like a tide, calming some who moments before had doubted. Evelyn's hands continued moving steady as the storm hammered harder, her face unreadable, her body calm, like she carried every gust of wind inside her already. Harrington straightened behind her, his voice soft, almost reverent. "Ghost hawk, take it all the way." Derek, silent now, leaned forward, watching every movement, no longer mocking, but learning. Plane steadied more clearly, the violent shakes fading into smoother tilts. Passengers gasped quietly, eyes wide, some tears falling, relief mixing with awe. Rosa's beads stopped clicking for a moment, her prayer pausing. Marissa slowly closing her phone. Greg sinking into his seat, his face pale as he realized the tide had turned against him. Woman in row 9, still standing, whispered softer, "Now come on, whoever you are. You have got this." And her words, though quiet, carried across the silence like a flame in the dark. Rosa nodded. Mia filmed, her face serious now, not mocking, her brother whispering, "She is more than a story. She is the reason we will land in the cockpit." Evelyn flicked another switch, her voice calm and sure. Cross winds 90, leveling left engine, stabilizing, her hands a blur yet steady, her notebook still resting on the panel, the initials, JN catching the faint light. Harrington exhaled, whispering, "You have it. Ghost hawk, you have it." And for the first time since the flight began, he stood tall, no longer afraid. The storm raged outside, But inside the cockpit a different kind of silence grew, the silence of trust, the silence of hope, the silence that comes when fear begins to fade. Evelyn's hands moved with precision, her pale eyes fixed on the glowing instruments, the faint hum of the override system filling the space. While Harrington watched like a man seeing a miracle with his own eyes, Derek sat forward, no longer mocking, his voice low, almost cautious, as he said, "She is really doing it." And Harrington only nodded, his lips tight, his respect unspoken, but clear. Evelyn did not look at either of them, her hands steady, her body calm, as though her breath itself was tied to the rhythm of the plane in the cabin. The passengers felt the difference first. The shakes eased, then the dips smoothed, the wild tilt steadied into balance, and with every second of calm the voices grew softer. Rosa's beads slowed in her hand, her lips still whispering, but her eyes lifting with quiet relief. The mother in row 7 loosened her arms around her son, the boy looking up wide-eyed, saying, "Mom, it is better," and she nodded, her tears shining in the dim light. Greg sat hunched now, his earlier shouting shrinking to mutters, his phone in his hand, but his fingers not moving, his face pale, as he realized the power had shifted. Marissa tapped her screen slower, each post more uncertain, her earlier confidence drained away as the truth unfolded before her. Leia stood taller near the galley, her voice steadier, as she whispered to those nearby, "She knows what she is doing. She is saving us." The old pilot in the jacket stood with arms folded, his voice low but carrying across the rows, "I told you, Ghost. Hawk saved lives before, and she is saving them now." His words heavier than Greg's protests, his presence enough to keep the cabin quiet. Mia kept filming, her phone steady, this time her voice soft, as she told her brother, "This is not just a story, this is history." Back in the cockpit, Evelyn pressed one last switch, her voice calm, though the storm still roared outside. Preparing descent, she whispered, her fingers brushing her notebook, as if touching the initials carved there gave her strength. Harrington's voice cracked with emotion, "Ghost Hawk, I will never forget this." And Derek leaned back silent, the respect in his eyes unhidden now. Plane dipped slowly but evenly, the turbulence still there, but manageable, passengers gripping armrests but no longer screaming. Instead they held their breath as the runway lights appeared faint below through the rain. Rosa's prayer grew louder, her voice guiding hope across the cabin, the young woman in row 9 whispering again, "Come on, you can do this. We believe in you." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her hands adjusting controls with precision. The wheels lowered, the lights inside flickered and then steadied. Harrington called the numbers, altitude, speed, angle, but Evelyn's hands never hesitated. She guided the Dreamliner like it was part of her body, the storm battering harder, but her will stronger. The touchdown came smooth like silk, the wheels kissing the runway, emerging